They're full of data. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, shipmates. Hope you had a good time in Roatan. And some of us went snorkeling and scared the fish. But we're going to go on in this region of the Western Caribbean, which is home to the largest barrier reef and coral structure other than the Great Barrier Reef. And so this is the attraction of this part of the world coming down. The reef comes down here to Roatan, goes all the way up to Cozumel. So we'll be visiting more of it, and it is a kind of a dramatic seascape at places because we'll see mountains as we did Honduras today. We'll see more in Belize, and then it gets very flat up in the Yucatan. So I'm going to show you some of the context for Belize and then Cozumel, but particularly I'm going to give you a little taste of the Mayan culture, this is the heart of the Mayan land. And after having been into Peru and Ecuador and having our experience with some of the Incan culture and all the ancient cultures, as Dr. Castillo presented, well, this is the other contrast of an early civilization that reached a very remarkable level of sophistication in various ways and then was utterly destroyed pretty much and is now once again appreciated for its traditional culture and trying to maintain what's left of it. So I'll show you just where we're going, first of all. This is actually Ambris Key in Belize, and that's about 50 sea miles off of Belize City. We don't get to stop there. It does not have a big dock, but that's one of the prime resorts for diving and seeing this great reef. So we've come all the way from Panama, all the way up to Puerto Limon. We went between Isla de San Andres, Providencia, around the Cayos Mosquitos. We took a big swing, if you saw the ship's track, out around that rather than get too close because you can see the continental shelf is very shallow all the way out there, almost all the way to Jamaica. And then we come to Roatan, Isla de la Bahia, the Bay Islands. Of course, they were English-speaking until they were given to Honduras again, and now it's mixed language, as you may have heard. Then we're going to go into the reefs off of Belize City, and then go on inland into Belize, and then Cozumel is just to the north of that. So this is the great Yucatan Peninsula, which is north of Guatemala on the east coast of Mexico. It's sort of a world apart compared to many other parts of Mexico. It was somewhat abandoned for many years, and only recently have they been building roads around it, and they're actually promoting it as a tourist destination, particularly Cancun and the other attractions of Cozumel and these other Mayan sites all through the area. There's a controversial proposal to build a train from Mexico City all the way to Cozumel, but plowing through how many archaeological sites and how many undisturbed ecosystems to do that and bring in ever more people. Now, of course, many people just fly in, so I don't know if that railroad will ever be economically viable. But above all, in the center is that great Maya Biosphere Reserve, which is shared between Guatemala and Mexico and Belize. So if you take it just as the land itself, you have the highlands, which are in this case due south of this great flat land, and then to the north it gets drier and drier, so you have a somewhat of a parched land in the north end of Yucatan, and you see Cozumel, the island off of the very tip of it, not far from Cancun. A lot of rivers that flow into the Gulf of Honduras or in the Bay of Campeche. And so this is the same kind of a diverse ecosystem like we had in Costa Rica, where you have two coasts, Pacific and Atlantic, and a mountain range in between, which traditionally separated all these peoples so that they didn't share the same language. And this tropical forest in the center of the Yucatan is partly preserved, I'd say. It was this whole area was the source of what they used to call Honduran mahogany, and I happen to have a boat that's made out of all Honduran mahogany, which they don't allow to harvest except sustainably anymore. The big trees are already gone. Now they have some plantations of it, but that's one of the featured hardwoods in the area. But here you can see the reef of all the way coming up from the Gulf of Honduras, where we are, and then up to these, you see the large coral reefs that are offshore Belize going up. Cozumel's up there on the upper right-hand corner. But inland, it is variously agricultural or preserve, and this is the contrast of what happens if you don't save the forest. This is the Mexican-Guatemalan border, and you see in Mexico, because of their high population and the hunger of their economy, they've cut down the entire forest and made it into cattle ranching and such. But there is the preserve, which is full of wildlife, and that goes all the way to Belize, where we'll go see some of it. The unusual thing about this land is that it is an uplifted, mostly limestone and other sedimentary rock. It was formerly a seabed, and so it's very porous. And what's the nature of it has very shallow soil, and if they cut it, it turns into desert. But underneath the land, there are all these freshwater rivers and pockets and connecting systems of caves with fresh water in it, even if the upper land is becoming a desert in some places in the north. So that's the kind of ecosystem that the Mayan people adapted to. And similarly what Dr. Castillo was talking about, the unusual ecological conditions created a kind of a culture that thrived as much as it could within this limitation of water especially. And so drought became the key reason why the Mayan kingdoms struggled, fell, fought with each other. And even now up in the upper valleys, you can see you have forest cover, but then you have intensive agriculture, a lot of population that has moved into this area. There was an estimated maybe 5 million Mayan at the height of it, and then the collapse depopulated, especially the European diseases decimated the whole region pretty much, and it's only in the last century that their population has grown to what it used to be. And so again, this kind of subsistence agriculture is bad for the land, but it is productive enough to allow the population to sustain itself. Mostly small slash and burn cornfields, beans, squash, corn. Those are the three sisters, they call it, of the agriculture here. They often grow them together so that they will help each other. Here's a cornfield with squash and beans planted in it. So they sort of have a symbiotic relationship in the sense that they help preserve the soil and they get an annual or biannual crop out of it. And therefore the cuisine, like we will have been tasting at SALT, is masa, which is the cornmeal that is used for making tamales. Tomatoes are a native Mexican Nahuatl word, so that when you think you're having tomato sauce on Italian pasta, well, it's actually Mexican sauce of the tomato, but that word is actually Nahuatl native. And then all the other things, the other gifts of the Americas, chocolate particularly. But these are some of the sites. There are tens of thousands, maybe not the 100,000 as in Peru and up in the Andes, but just the Mayan area, not the Toltec and the Aztec and the number of other people to the west and to the north, but just the Mayan area alone stretches in this region. People go to Palenque, Uxmal, Chichen Itza. I believe some people are going there for the day. That's a long trip. And then when we're at Cozumel on the island off of there. But there are many, many sites. Many of them are under jungle cover, and they are now being found by those techniques that Dr. Castillo talked about, LIDAR and ground-penetrating radar, so they don't have to cut to trees and dig and find stuff. They can see a lot just from the air, and satellite and now drones. So this is Chichen Itza, it's Tikal. This is in Guatemala, due west of Belize. And again, it's the ceremonial plaza with the main temple, the ball court for the game called Pocatoc, and then there are many other buildings. And this was just the center of a large city with tens of thousands of people. They found roads and foundations stretching way out beyond what they have excavated. And so this is the great temple at Tikal, one of the steepest, and of course the priest would have ceremonies on the top, and it was, the Mayan culture was somewhat like the Incans. It was a divine royalty and the human sacrifice and various deities, but there was never a unified kingdom of the Maya like there was in the Incan time or other earlier Peruvian civilizations. But nonetheless, there's a lot of commonality of deities, war gods, jaguar gods, Quetzal bird gods, all kinds of representations either in frescoes or in tomb findings. So when the Europeans came here, they thought that, well, this is an extremely lush land with particularly a lot of wood resources. There was not much gold here, but there was jade, and the valuable preciousness of jade to the Mayan has been compared to what it was to the Chinese in ancient and present times. So a lot of settlers came here, and the agriculture was terrible. If they cut down the trees, tried to plant any crops, they usually didn't hold, particularly European crops, wheat or any of that, orchards, all of that would never survive in this particular tropical environment, which was subject to drought also. And so there was a lot of conflicts with the locals who either fled the Spanish or else were caught and enslaved if they did not submit. And then it established the typical Creole society where there was a Spanish-style town and then haciendas that were out into the countryside as much as they could. This end of Mexico largely started to make ranching. That was the big business to this day, just because the soil is not good for much agriculture other than sort of subsistence, small plot farming. There were uprisings of the Maya repeatedly that ended up in what was a general war in this area called the War of the Castes between the Mexican authorities and indigenous people of different areas, and so this lasted for years and devastated the last remaining large settlements of the Maya back in the 1830s. And then the remaining population was put to work. There is sugarcane on other sides toward the Gulf of Campeche, and so that's what this card is carrying. And here's the payoff of the campesinos by the master of the hacienda. And so this was in a way, it still is the situation. You have large business in Mexico, Guatemala, not so much Belize, which have employees, but much of the direction finance comes from the bigger cities of Mexico. When the whole area was, let's say, lifted from the Spanish empire, you had this curious variety of countries. First of all, Venezuela and Colombia were the Union of Gran Colombiana, they call, before they separated later. You see what the black island, that's Hispaniola, which actually is incorrectly so, because Haiti is the western side and the Dominican Republic is the eastern side. You see the Spanish held Cuba and Puerto Rico until the Spanish-American War, but Central America tried to have a federated union of the Central American states, which broke apart when Honduras and Costa Rica and Nicaragua couldn't decide how to cooperate as a unit. All they knew is they didn't want to be part of Mexico. But you see the brown is the British territories, Belize being a crown colony until 1950s. And then there was a strip in Nicaragua called the Mosquito Coast where they had the Garifuni African indigenous mixture who speak English. And so for those of you who went on the Garifuna tour today, you may have heard some of that kind of inflected English that is spoken commonly in Belize. Well, when Belize was given its independence, Guatemala claimed it. They said, well, the British have no right to be in Central America. The small population of Belize, which is only 2 million people, they English speaking, often educated, back in the UK, some of them maintain their, let's say, independence of their state because the British military had tropical training in Belize just to make sure the Guatemalans just didn't walk over and come in. That's true to this day. But they still claim the southern half of the country. Well, this is the land of Belize. You see what they have in the coastal lowlands, and then this very rugged range of mountains right in the southwest of Belize going into Guatemala. That's called the Monkey Mountains because it's full of monkeys, first of all, but it's also impenetrable. It's like the thickest rainforest jungle this side of Panama. And so there's a coastal culture, and then there's agriculture in the north. But a lot of it is uninhabited, and then there's the Belize River, which runs from the west out into the sea at Belize City. And here's the map of it with Belmopan as the capital. But again, the straight line division of it was done by treaty at a certain point, and a lot of people come and go in that area without worrying about the border. This is Belize City back under the name British Honduras in the 1914. I found this rather unclear copy of a panoramic photo that stretches 3 times as far, so you can see one of those panoramic photographs of that era. This is what it looks like now. It's a fairly big city with a central waterway, which is the outflow of the Belize River, and then the Caribbean Sea out there. Our ship will be anchored off this, and we'll be tendering into right about on the north end up here. There's no shadow, but on the left side of the screen is where we will land, and then we go out. Again, this is one of those cruise docks that have been built just like the one here in Roatan, which is designated for cruise passengers, full of shops and the parking lot, and it's not available for the local people to come there at all except to work in the shops or help the ships. Here's the capital up in the grasslands and central area, and it is sort of a spacious small city without that much interest. And then there's the people, which are on the coast. They are Garifuni, African, Caribbean, indigenous mixed people with their own dance and religious customs that you may have heard some of today. But this is the contrast with the Mayan, who are inland. And then there's another group called the Mennonites, the German evangelical refugees from Germany to North America, and then many of them have uprooted from Pennsylvania and other parts of the United States and Canada, come down and made large agricultural businesses and communities in Belize and other parts of South America, actually. So you'll see them in Belize City. They still speak a archaic form of German, along with Spanish and English. Well, anyway, people come here to see the great coastline and the Great Reef. Again, this is the Great Barrier Reef of the Americas, and it stretches for hundreds of miles and is mostly intact. That's a problem because the warming seas have been killing a lot of the coral, and there's programs to restore it here I'll allude to. But this is just part of the coast of Belize, which is very low, flat, has lagoons, some of them freshwater, brackish water, and so this is a very active biosphere with a lot of reproduction of marine life and turtles and things like this. And most of it is in fairly pristine shape. They have not had the phenomena of building too many hotels down here yet. And again, people come here to go diving a lot. This is again Ambergris Key. And you have a few modest hotels, but you see that house in the middle. That's actually a traditional Mayan house called a Na, single room house. It's there as a shelter on the dock, but they're all through the countryside. If you take the trip even out of Belize City up to the rivers, and I'm going tubing on a river, you'll see the Mayans nearby. Well, this is the Great Blue Hole, which is a natural phenomena of the seabed, which again is limestone and very porous. This had a collapse, so there's about a 40-meter drop vertical wall of limestone down to another ground, but it's teeming with aquatic life, and so that's a favorite dive spot and sort of the iconic seascape of Belize. And so if you are a diver, a snorkeler, there's plenty to see, like some of us did today. And then if you go upriver, you have these tropical meandering rivers. And so Barbara and I, when we were, let's say, testing our honeymoon, we came down with a folding Klepper sail kayak and camping out of it. We came by bus from Cancun, Quintana Roo, down to Belize City, and then took another bus and put our kayak together. We figured we'd start up in the hills and we'd come down the river and we would camp, and then we would go out to sea to go swimming. Well, we survived and went through all of this dense jungle And we didn't have a map, but we just sort of followed the river. It was going around, a lot of obstructions, a lot of alligators, a lot of fire ants on the beach and mosquitoes and all that. And later I saw her journal, and she said, I can't believe I went with this jerk to go get bitten and almost eaten alive. And so then, but there's a lot of life in these rivers. So this, particularly the manatee, dugong, with many names for it, but the classic sea cow, which is there munching on the grasses in the fresh and brackish water. So there's a lot of jungle nearby. Much of it in the highlands has already been cut, so you have a lot of kind of scrubby interior land. Only down in the Monkey Mountains are there extensive old-growth forest at all, which is now all part of the larger preserve. So like many of these places, they've had a goal to preserve 25. Now the UN goal, 30% of this land should be reserved for nature and not all clear-cut and such. And so a lot of it's just pretty much impenetrable. It's not very high. It's just rugged. And in there, they keep finding Mayan ruins, particularly burial sites deep in caves. But in the flatlands, you'll have this kind of ranching grasslands, big tropical trees like this arbol de guacaste, which has a certain fruit that they make sauces and flavorings out of. Here's a tree we saw the other day on our hike in Costa Rica, the kapok tree, which has these incredible spines on it to keep us from climbing it, I guess. But that particular tree is like a balsa wood. It's so light that it was used to make life jackets in previous centuries. A kapok jacket was the fiber that they grind up. It was also used for making parchment for some of the Mayan codices. They would use it to make paper. Now it's a wild tree that grows around. They also have plantations of achiote, which is a spice for many Latin American cuisines. And then there's a lot of wildlife, of course, where it is allowed in its natural state. The coati sort of looks like what's that look like? A raccoon with a shave or a haircut. But these are some of them are nocturnal. You don't get to see them in the day, particularly midday. And then there's a whole variety of snakes and pythons. What's the word? You should never invite a python for lunch because he might eat you. And this one too, in the river. We would see them sort of following our kayak, wondering whether we were tasty enough. But famously, there are a lot of monkeys, spider monkeys, capuchin white-faced monkeys, but most famously the howler monkey. And this is, we actually heard one the other day. They are, let's say, territorial, and you can see the look on this guy saying, I didn't invite you for dinner here. And they come in these different colors. They almost look like orangutan, bright red, almost orange colored. And they will, an alpha male will have a territory with a number of females, and they will fight and chase off any other monkeys in the area. So here's one of them clearing his throat for his aria. And just in Costa Rica, Barbara was filming there, and she got this view of it, which we as I go on here. This is the howler chasing the capuchin monkeys away, or else chasing us away. Well, that was just a warning call, but we can all do it together now. 1, 2, 3. Well, we'll rehearse that and we'll be a show up here eventually. But, well, this is the kind of scary because we were going down the Belize River and we were camping on shores that were full of mangrove and such, and we couldn't get inland. And then we put our little tent on this little beach, and then as the sun went down, guess who came to visit? And they, they were walking around. We thought they were probably some local people because they were stomping around. And I was hiding with Barbara in our tent with my machete, ready to defend ourselves. They gathered our gear and started throwing it in the river. And so we started screaming and yelling, say, please, please do not do this to us, please. And we were, not harmed or anything, except that there's nothing louder than a howler monkey saying hello to you. Well, there are other animals in the uplands. This is particularly the American tapir, which is an elephant-like animal that is endangered also because it was hunted for food, but it's very shy and it stays hidden most of the time. But they're a kind of like a wild boar without the boorish looks to them. But they have this unusual four-toed hoof. And then there are a lot of birds. There's the kind of a cassowary that walks around, a pretty big bird, a big bright yellow beak. Then there's the famous quetzal, which was, again, a rare bird because it was hunted for its great feathers. And now it has been protected again. And if you ever see one, the local people say, well, you have good fortune because we normally don't see them unless you're here. And they were, again, venerated by the Mayan as a messenger of the gods. There's also a lot of scarlet macaws, which are prettier than they are close up because they'll bite your finger off if you get close to them. But they're let's say, the most colorful bird that you'll see commonly around here. Here's another one, which is the turkey vulture, wondering what's for lunch. They only eat leftovers. And the famous toucan. So these things can be seen out on these trips into the forest. But you're unlikely to see the king of the jungle here, the jaguar. And this, of course, was a god to the Mayans. And then since recent times it was hunted almost to extinction. Now it's preserved, and some of the hunters have been hired to be rangers to make sure that it's protected. But you'll see imageries of the jaguar all through the Mayan sculpture and on the temples as the symbol of power, sort of like the lion is in other parts of the world. Here's a Mayan festival, Pocho, where they get dressed up as jaguars and get spots all over their body and have a kind of ritual dance of the jaguars. Well, there are all these sites. Again, there are thousands more. These are just the major ones. Again, not many in Belize. There's one north of Belize City called Alta Hun. We sometimes go there. Or Cunhulich is just over the border into Mexico there. But again, they're finding more and more. The one we will go by that is most iconic is Tulum, which is a overlook watchtower over the sea. And the Mayans used to have seagoing trading canoes. Columbus and other early explorers described how these big constructed wooden canoes with up to 50 paddlers would be loaded with goods to go trade with Cuba and the other islands around. So this was perhaps a watch flame to let the navigators come in, or also it was an offering to the god of the wind, being in it's actually a Caribe word. Hurricane is the god of the wind. To be propitiated lest it gets too windy. But this is what's happened in modern times. This barrier spit on the north end of the reef has been built into Cancun, which I have to say is probably one of the most unsustainable looking places to have these mega resorts. And I was once there, and that beach had been eroded right up to the front door of those hotels. And so the Mexican government they dug up a whole other island, and they came to try to restore the beach lest nobody would want to go there. But that's also a reason why they've tried to spread the trouble out into all these other areas so that it isn't all concentrated in one place. One hurricane could knock all that completely away. That's the problem. There is regular hurricanes that come swinging up past Yucatan, and so we'll see if it's still there in 100 years. But here's Cozumel, where we're going. Um, this island is fairly flat, with a few Mayan ruins, particularly San Gervasio and El Castillo Real. And there are other ruins that are sort of sunken into the thin soil that is typical of this island. But the reason we go there is you see all these different reefs around it, particularly the Palancer Reef on the south side. But the problem is, of course, that it's become a cruise destination. I mean, many fishing and diving people have been going there for decades, and but now it has the multiple visitors every day. It's on the mega ship run, so just like we saw today, it may be full of people, and they go out on the island and go out on boats, and so this is where this cartoon comes in handy. He says it's not an invasion, it's a cruise. Well, we'll be landing at this main dock right in the center reception area. And if you don't leave by boat, which they sometimes do to go out snorkeling or diving off the pier, then you go into this reception building and on a passageway over into a parking lot and a bunch of shops, and then people can go out on their different excursions out into the countryside. But up and down the coast from here, there's all this development and resorts and hotels and beachfront clubs and fake Mayan temples like that big roof there. On the other side of Cozumel, there's a whole what they call the Maya coast, where they have incredibly, let's say, fake Mayan temples made out of all but cardboard, and the locals getting dressed up in war paint and all that kind of stuff. So I'm sure anthropologists come and they sort of cringe at the sight of this, but this is a major selling point for the Mexican economy on this side of Mexico. So you have to run through the gauntlet of Panama hats. Did anybody need one? Well, you got to go back to Ecuador to get the real one. Remember that. And then there's a town, so there's shopping and bars and nightlife and tequila, just what everybody needs after a long day burning in the sun. But people generally go out to the reefs and the beaches. But you can see the land is almost completely flat everywhere. And there's some lagoons, and so much of it is actually not developed. I mean, there may be 100,000 people living on the island, and they call themselves Cozumeleños. And they're proud of their island, except that they sometimes don't want so many visitors. This is the reef on the south end of the island, which is pristine and a preserve. The dive trips and the snorkel trips that are offered often only go a little ways and not all the way down to the outer reefs, just because that'll take a full day trip or else an overnight trip. So most people just go to the beach. So there's miles and miles of it. The surf is on the east shore, and then on the west shore facing where we're coming in, it's all tranquil. And again, you have to bring your own shade sometimes because it's pretty sunny around here. And so this is the interest of Cozumel. You can rent a car and you can drive all the way. There's a shore road all the way around the whole island. And so this is what people do. I don't know if you need a license to drive that. But people come and do this with the aqua helmet. And it's sort of like the lazy person's scuba diving. So you can walk around on shallow waters with air supply up above and go and talk to the fish. But they'll look at you and say, "What are these humans doing? What next? Why don't they leave us alone?" And some of the local people have been protesting the building of more hotels and the mega ships coming in. So here it says, danger, peligro, humans are destroying the environment. And so there's a, particularly among the political elections, there's always, let's say, the Green Party and others that are just trying to stop this rampant development, which sort of spreads like a tumor up and down the coast. Because what it's done is the runoff and the sewage and all that have been killing so much of the coral, especially on the west shore where we are landing. So there is a coral regeneration research project right in Cozumel City where we're going, where they have been pioneering what they call bio-rock planting, which is a kind of a limestone-based formed rock that is made in a certain structure that has water easily passing through it, and so naturally the polyps will attach to it. So what it does is it gives the fresh coral, which is released into the sea, and then it has to go around, float around. If it isn't eaten by other creatures, it will stick onto a rock or another shell. But this bio-rock is particularly adaptable to the new spawn of coral. And if you've ever seen those films, particularly Great Barrier Reef, when the moon is at the right brightness at a certain time of year, all the coral spread their eggs and their sperm, and they mix it all up in a big miasma of a cloud, and then they get spread around. And coral is very resilient. I mean, even if it's the main structure is knocked over by an anchor or dredged for construction, all the damage that is done by the humans, it can grow back quite readily if the conditions are right. So here's a web form of the bio-rock, where they either plant little polyps on it that are grown in a laboratory or in a nursery, or else it just sort of happens anyway. And curiously, this kind of a structure that is open and has, let's say, the nutrients that the coral filter out of the seawater, it grows the coral quite rapidly. And so this is where they're spreading this kind of a structure all around Cozumel. And they've now worked on over 3,000 plantings in areas to restore the reef back to what people remember just a few decades ago. So there is hope in the sea, and this is part of the global coral network, an organization, multinational, working in all the tropical seas from Indonesia to the Caribbean to the Red Sea and such. So you see the kind of mesh they make. That is what is adaptable pretty quickly for the coral. And so even a damaged reef by a hurricane or something like that, everything is sort of knocked down like we saw today diving. It will come back if given a chance. And this is a soft coral. The thousands of varieties of it. Now they've even been researching how the Red Sea coral, which can withstand the hottest seawater in the world, can be brought to other parts of the world to have more heat-resistant coral varieties in these other places. So here's a brain coral, which was empty of polyps. Then they put in, this actually has an electrical charge. So what they've also found is that when you have this mesh and you put a low voltage, maybe 5-volt DC current into the mesh, that encourages the growth many more times faster than it would on its own. And it will also make much more vibrant coral. This is a curious one because when they turn that little electrical bleed, like just a tiny bit of electricity off, it changes color. And when they turn the electricity on, it changes into this bright blue and grows fast. So this is sort of coral on steroids. Then they've also experimented to put LED blue and green lights onto their nurseries and onto their restoration projects, and they find that artificial light also encourages the growth. And then even more so, I went diving at this site a couple of years ago. They've commissioned architects to design coral condos, which again have that mesh, and then they provide a little bit of electricity to it, and then within a year or two it's just covered with coral, and then the fish have their own suite with butler service, whatever they provide, I'm not sure. But this is the result of many years of research and effort to try to see what you can do about this terrible problem of all these reefs having such trauma. And so there is hope under the sea. And I'll give another talk about the oceanography and ecology of the general Caribbean. And the Caribbean has probably had the greatest loss of coral life than any other sea in the world, but it also has the most program to restore it or preserve it. Now I'm going to go back inland, because once you're back on dry land, this is the coastal road, and you can see that the interior of Cozumel is this scrub and no forest, no wildlife beyond rodents and things like that. But I think some people are going on a tour inland to one of the cacao plantations where they will show you how they make chocolate. And of course this is the native gift to the world. The cacao bean and the making of chocolate was a Mayan and then an Aztec and other Mesoamerican tradition, except that it was those Europeans who decided to add milk and sugar to it and ruin it, because it was meant as a bitter substance, and it is still made in what they call mole sauce. If you've ever tasted that in Mexican cooking, it is cacao paste, and it is merely sort of a flavoring, but it's not sweet. But it has this strong organic compounds, just like we know with our sweet chocolate. And so here's a Mayan god of cacao. He has the pods growing out of him, and a cup for drinking the cacao as a bitter drink. It's stronger than coffee, and it's kind of it's not alcoholic, but it's pretty intense to drink it. And then the other great crop of this part of the world, of course, is maize, corn. So this is a corn god that is hanging in my house, hoping it'll bless my little corn garden. But this is the staple here. Of course, corn is so familiar to all of us, but it was originally a wild plant called teosote in Nahuatl. And it was like a grass that would grow and have a few corn seeds. And then back in antiquity, whether it may have been Mayan, it may have been Olmec, even further back, we don't know. I'm not a researcher on this, but they were able to make it with a cob that had more corn. And then it's subsequently been hybrid to the point where we have these giant cobs with plenty of kernels, and that's become a staple food around the world. But there's research to try to make it a perennial rather than having to grow it, cut it down, plant it, do it all over again the next year. So there are agronomist centers in Mexico and other parts of the world that are like rice. They've been doing this in China with rice, trying to make perennial rice that has the same yield as the annual crop. So this would be a big change here because there's such hard labor bringing in the corn crop, especially by hand in this part of the world. But the Mayan are still here. And they are a proud people who mostly have kept their language. They had many languages depending on where they were, all the way to Guatemala or up in the highlands or down to the lowlands. But this is one of their houses, the Na, they call it, in this Quechua people's area. So it has a thatched roof and a pounded adobe wall and the open walkway and the pounded earth floor. But in this climate, it's actually very compatible because you get this hot sun in the day, but you always have a breeze through the roof, so it doesn't collect heat in the house. And then at night, when it's colder, the ground is giving warmth into the house. So some of the Mayans say, well, if you want to live in one of those condos, you have to have electricity, air conditioning, and all those other expenses. If you just lived like us, things would be more affordable. And so you come from where we are, Belize, into Guatemala, into the highlands especially. You get the most intact communities of the Maya. And of course, they're famous for their weavings. Now, this is comparable to what was in Peru, where the textile tradition has continued on to today. And so that's a major trade item and an industry on its own. So you'll see people selling this, a lot of it, people can, well, now that's just tourist stuff, but they're actually making it all the time. In contrast to earlier centuries, this is all chemical and extremely bright work, which they like. But here are a couple of Mayan girls with a very lovely pattern on their own dresses that they probably made themselves. And there's been a lot of advocacy for these people, particularly considering how much abuse they took recently with the attack on them in the Guatemalan upheavals of the last number of decades, where for reasons that I still don't understand, the military attacked the Mayan villages up in the uplands of Guatemala. And then this woman came forth as their leading advocate, Rigoberta Menchú, and she was a very articulate leader in her community that went to the UN and went to the International Court of Justice and finally reined in the Guatemalan junta that was massacring her people. And she single-handedly sort of organized her variety of communities and stopped this war. But the problem with the Maya, like many other indigenous people in developing countries, is that the demographics continues to confound their prosperity. So I don't have the graph here, but every generation in this last century, the Mayan population, due to public health programs and prevention of certain diseases, has doubled every generation. So They were about 2 million people in general in 1900. Now they are over 12 million people. What that means in a land that is only so big is that they cannot support their own population. That's why they're walking to the American border. And you see them. I have a lot of Mayan friends I see in New York even. But their traditions also continue. Here's a weaver on the loom, the traditional loom. But this has been going on a long time. Here's a sculpture from about 700 AD of the same process. And then there's the ball game, the poktok, which is when you go to a Mayan site, you'll get a big pitch of the play field in front of the temple and the stadium up above. And the goal of it is to have a hard rubber ball, and with your head and your feet, you try to get it through that circle. It makes international World Cup football seem easy because they got a big goal. But this would be played as ritual warfare, so that the losers would often be sacrificed at the temple for the without the replay of the game. And so here's another sculpture of Mayan, again 600 to 700 AD, of a poktok player with the rubber ball. By the way, that's a Mayan invention. Anybody throws a ball at you, that's from ancient Mayan culture. And rubber, again, is a American wild plant in the Amazon that was also brought up to this area. So even any rubber ball is traditional here. But notice it looks like he had a bruise from too many saves at the goal there. But now they're playing it again. Even in the temple areas, they're allowing these games to happen again, because like in Peru, a lot of these indigenous traditions are now being respected, allowed, promoted, and have competitions, and sort of returning a sense of pride and identity to these people. And even down in the village level, they play the game on the streets, and they have a name called Ulana in parts of Mexico, where again you're not allowed to use your hands, which is a curious restriction. But then there are the other, let's say, more human indulgences around here. This is one of the earliest depictions of smoking tobacco, that American weed that was sent around the world. And here's another effigy of a fellow drinking chicha, or actually here they have a different name for it, but it's corn beer. And so this guy has decided whether or not trying to think whether he's had too much. But by the time you wonder if you've had too much, well, have some more, then you can decide, right? And then there's a musical tradition. Here's a temple painting of a parade blowing conch shells and playing rain sticks. These are bamboo sticks that are full of rocks and have sticks, and so they make the sound of rain as you turn them over or shake them like a rattle, this sort of thing. And then here's another traditional instrument with the Mayan harp. And so this is a living culture. And the more they keep finding archaeological evidence of this tradition, this is much to the pride of the local people. So here again are some of the ceramics they've been finding, and like in Peru, they keep finding more every season or years. This fellow looks like he is, dressed for New Year's Eve maybe. And here's another effigy going to the beach. I don't know what she's thinking there. But some of these, we just sort of wish we had somebody that could tell us a little bit about it. Now, unlike the Incans and the other ancient Peruvians, the Mayan had a very literate hieroglyphic alphabet. So we've been reading their inscriptions for many decades now that it's been deciphered. There are a number of versions of it, but this was a very artistic culture: ceramics, writing, wall painting, and again in architecture. So this is a site in Cozumel. This is San Gervasio, which is a temple complex which had probably once had thatched roofs in the back, but it created this, what's left is a facade of this temple with a very dramatic effect, particularly if you backlight it. And so this is where you can feel the ghosts of the past in the sound and light shows that they sometimes put on in these Mayan temple areas. Of course, most people will go inland to see the great high temples. There are none of these of that scale in Cozumel, but again, there are hundreds of them, and then they're often surrounded or placed between what they call the cenote, or the sacred wells. And again, the limestone rock tends to collapse or get worn away by water. There are heavy rains, and then they fill up these underground lakes. And then at times of drought, they were used as places for human sacrifice to appease the gods for more rain. And so when the first European archaeologists came, they actually went down to see what was in these things, because they were told by the local people that that's a holy well, you should not go there because we don't want to tell you about it. So they built this one walkway down near the great cenote at Chichen Itza, and then they realized that this underground water is fairly pure. It's been filtered by the limestone, and so you can go diving and exploring. So this has been one whole section of underwater Mayan archaeology goes scuba diving, and then they keep finding more passages. And so the what's above ground is sort of matched by a wet world down below, and as you go down, then that's where they find a lot of remains of sacrifice, ritually killed. They find jade down there and some other artifacts from the rituals. And also up in the Chichen Itza, this is Caricol. This is the great astronomical observatory, which by research has been shown to indicate the winter solstice and the summer solstice, and so is used perhaps for divination or making of the calendars. And so the Mayans are particularly famous for having a very complicated calendar system, which includes 20 months of 13 days in a 52-year cycle. And those are the hieroglyphic names of the months and the days, and then the number system in the middle is it's actually a 20 unit number system. And so this sort of wheel of time would be measured and cut into calendars, and then they would have ceremonies and or other events we don't know about, because they had this rather extended sense of time and careful timekeeping because of their view of astronomy. So here's another view of it. Oh no, 30 days hath September. And so this was common throughout. The Aztecs and the Olmecs also had this sort of calendar, and even if it's not used these days, it's venerated as sort of one of those heights of human imagination. And then the Mexican, Guatemalan countries have been allowing the Maya and their various groups to come back to the temples and have certain ceremonies and gatherings again, which were totally banned by the Catholic Church until recently. And so now it's, let's say, more tolerant and perhaps healthier and more vibrant culture than it's been in centuries. Particularly the collapse of the Mayan civilization was attributed to extreme drought, warfare between the different kingdoms, and it was all pretty much over before the conquistadors came here, and they only had some records, the codexes, and some descriptions of it. But it is, in a sense, a culture that is in a certain point of revival at this point. And so when you come just to Cozumel, you go to this great site at Tulum. That was the site of, maybe 10 or more years ago, when the Mayan calendar was supposedly in its umpteenth 52-year cycle, that it was going to be the end of the world soon. So many a spiritual tourist and truth seeker came and camped on the beach waiting for the world to end. And the Mayan council, such as it is in the area, they kept putting out press releases. No, this is ancient wisdom, but it doesn't mean the world's going to come to an end. Please don't get too upset. So the sun rose over the Caribbean, over Cozumel, and sure enough, the world continued. And so I'm going to read you one last poem of Pablo Neruda, and this is sort of in homage to the island of Cozumel, even though he was writing about his own home, Isla Negra in Chile. And this is called El Viento en la Isla, The Wind on the Island, of Pablo Neruda. Said, the wind is a horse. See how it runs in the sea, in the sky. I want to arise and listen, how to recover the world, to arise far away. I hid in your arms for this only night. while the rain beats against the sea and the land, its mouth a myriad. Listen how the wind calls me while galloping, to take me far away. With your chest to my chest, with your mouth to my mouth, joining our bodies. Love that inflames us, wait until the wind passes without being able to take me away. Wait until the wind runs, crowned with feathers, that calls and searches for me, galloping in the shadows, while I submerged beneath your great eyes, for only this night, I rest my love. Well, thank you very much, and have a great trip to Belize and Cozumel. Oh, you're welcome.